Moving on now then to finish chapter 5 of Heidegger's Being in Time. This is the section, letter B, the everyday being of the there and the falling of Dasein. And so this section gets into how Dasein dissipates its energies that it needs for authenticity into the inauthenticity of the they, basically the crowd. And I think Heidegger's discussion of the they here, really what he's talking about, although he doesn't say it in this chapter, is what he's really talking about is the crowd of the modern cosmopolis, the great megalopolis that has come into being in places like Berlin and Paris and London. You get the opening line, for instance, of Rilke's Notebooks of Malta Loritz Brugge, which is his only novel that he put out in 1910, shortly after moving to Paris in 1902. And the opening line of that novel is, so this is where people come to live. It looks more to me like a place where people come to die. And I think that Heidegger's attitude toward the modern megalopolis was shared in common by a lot of great Germans like Rilke, like Oswald Spengler, like Rudolf Steiner. There were a number of Germans who shared this resistance to modernity, this antipathy toward the project of building huge, secularized, atheistic cosmopolises with their glib, trivial, shallow mode of existence, mass crowds. Spengler talks about all of this, and I think that in Decline of the West, Spengler's distinction between Kultur and civilization, those two terms should be held up against Heidegger's distinction between authenticity and inauthenticity. For Spengler, Kultur was the great phase that every civilization goes through in its vital lyrical living aspect when it is motivated by art and metaphysics and philosophy, whereas civilization is the phase of decadence that is motivated no longer by those great lyrical metaphysical concerns, but rather by the pragmatic concerns of politics and economics and money. It's ruled by money, and the city shifts from the small town basically to the megalopolis, the Hellenistic style megalopolis, which is a huge urban agglomeration that's uprooted from the countryside, very crowded. Most of the people living there don't belong there or have come from elsewhere. They've come pouring in from the countryside looking for work. It's composed of landless, propertyless people who have come in looking for work, and they cause these huge crowds, and there's just this emphasis on spectacle. Bread and circuses, that becomes the whole modality. And that whole sort of trivial, shallow approach to modernity is what Heidegger, I think, is expressing in the second half of this chapter, or the latter part of it, when he analyzes what he calls the existential mode of the everydayness of Dasein in the mode of the they. But I think that even though he is talking about this as, or presenting it as part of the everyday feature of Dasein, I think it's really Dasein's being in the world, being in the mode of a cosmopolis that he's resisting here as being. That is the inauthentic mode that corrupts Dasein, that deviates Dasein from its purpose, that distracts it and dissipates its energies into fallenness. And so the first of these structures that he talks about, these existentials, is idle talk. Idle talk we've already mentioned a little bit about. Idle talk, Gerede, chatter, is basically gossip. It is what's in the air. One does and says what everyone else does and says. One goes to read what everyone says you should be reading. One buys, one wears what everyone says you should be wearing. One goes to the plays that everyone says you have to have seen to be anyone. And so one lives an inauthentic life insofar as one is always running around doing and saying and thinking what everyone else says. And there's a kind of conformity there. There's a kind of trepidation of developing an authentic opinion that might contradict what the crowd says is the case. If the crowd says Harry Potter is great, well, then it must be great. And so it's a shallow, glib, inauthentic life. And Heidegger says that it can even dissipate. It's not just vocal. It also turns up in books in the form of a writing that he calls Geschreibe, or Geschreiben, scribbling. So that we have all these bestsellers with their trivialities and their mundanities and their banalities and their substitution of the difficulty of wrestling great truths out from the primordial ground of being. They're substituted for these microwave cliches that a Deepak Chopra or a Wayne Dyer or a Thomas More can simply pull like rabbits out of their hat and hand over to you, and you can just pick it up and put it in your pocket and use the saying as common coin. So that's idle talk. The next structure is curiosity. And by curiosity, what he means is curiosity presents the world in such a way that you're always moving from one spectacle to the next. And you're never staying very long with any one thing. It's the crowd always running restlessly to see the new thing. Let's go to the new panorama. Let's go over here to see this new arcade. Let's go see this new thing called a movie theater and see what that's all about. Let's go to this Barnum and Bailey exhibition, and so on. It's just the mode of bouncing around from one spectacle to the next. It's the bread and circuses mode of curiosity, and part of the constitutive nature of the being of curiosity is not tarrying. You're in constant restless motion from one spectacle to the next. Your curiosity is glib, and you're not really interested in learning about anything in depth, but just bouncing from one thing to the next as pure entertainment. And there is no real kind of curiosity. This isn't the curiosity of natural science or the curiosity of philosophy that leads one to spend long, deep, extended meditations on things. The temporal modality of Dasein, proper Dasein, authentic Dasein, moves much slower than the glib temporality of the they, which is a much more rapid metabolic metabolism that moves very rapidly and cycles through things, bounces around from thing to thing. So we have distraction and not tarrying as the two basic structures of the being of curiosity. And once again, this is the crowd, this is the world. I think that Walter Benjamin wrote about in the Arcades Project when he analyzes Paris in the 19th century, which invented this whole way, this trivial way of existing in the world in a shallow, glib, superficial way. And the third of these structures then is ambiguity. And by ambiguity, I think ambiguity, a better word for it would be either fickleness or fashion, because basically what Heidegger means by ambiguity is that the crowd is always trying to guess what's coming up next. And when the thing that comes up next, the new thing comes up, its attention is immediately turned elsewhere to the next thing. So that the new thing is always simultaneously coming to being and becoming the new fad, the new fashion, and becoming passé at the same time. So there's this basic ambiguity or fickleness about the public that's always second-guessing what's coming along and is always interested in something else the moment that the new thing comes along. So there's this constant urge for stimulus. And even Heidegger also says that both curiosity and idle talk can affect the being with one another in a detrimental way, such that friends themselves become questionable entities. One rapidly cycles through these so-called friends, and there is even more of a sense, rather than a being with one another, there's more of a sense of an against one another about these so-called friends, whom one is always testing to see if there's anything to them. But in this mode, in the mode of the cosmopolitan being in the world, of course, friends don't amount to much. If they cycle through as quickly as last year's clothing fashions, they don't and can't amount to much. So this is the modality of modern man in the state of fallenness. And Heidegger says in the end of this chapter that he doesn't mean by this any kind of a theological original sin that fundamentally stains Dasein in some fundamental way. And I don't think that he's saying anything like that at all. In fact, the architecture of the chapter, as I said in a previous talk, has this sense of the evolution of a civilization where you begin with a mood and a particular thrownness that leads to the understanding projecting a world forth, and then you have interpretation and hermeneutics, and then gradually then you move into this sort of phase of the dissipation of all these energies in the state of fallenness. Fallenness comes in at the end, just as it does in Spengler's model of the rise and fall of civilization. Fallenness comes in at the end with the rise of the urban agglomeration, the highly artificial megalopolitan mode of being where everything is cycled through and becomes merely trendy. And there is no real depth of being. And slowly being begins to abandon beings. As Heidegger will later say, us moderns, we are beings who have been abandoned by beings. And one proceeds to make, in both the arts and in technology, trivial objects that are mere objects, no longer things with a capital T, that are immersed in being, that anchors them as a transcendental signified and gives to them a depth and a resonance that they once had but no longer do have. Walter Benjamin's historical aura is a perfect example of what gets shorn away in the mass consumer megalopolitan world of the sort of crystal palace world of the inner world of capitalism that came into being in the middle of the 19th century, and that Heidegger is resisting here. And you can see that the German mentality is based on resisting this, and that went right down into World War II, that basic resistance. One of the things about Hitler, when he, in conversation with his architect Speer, they would draw up models for how they were going to redesign Berlin and get rid of the cabarets and the prostitutes and all the modernity and decadence and redesign it as a city for culture and the arts. And for them, the horror was the American metropolis of department stores and gas stations. That was the thing that to them represented the absolute horror. And I think there's a certain consistency there with that kind of Nazi attitude toward modernity. It's typical of a general German attitude toward a resistance toward modernity that we find here in Heidegger just as well as we find it in Spengler and in Rilke and in Steiner. But he says that it's not theological, it's not original sin, it's something that gradually creeps into Dasein, stains it over time with inauthenticity, and deviates it from its axial alignment with its own inner purpose, that is living an authentic life, authenticating yourself, becoming a real, actual three-dimensional subjectivity rather than picking up a merely two-dimensional cardboard cutout cliched persona and presenting yourself in the mode of a celebrity who is famous for being famous and for no other reason than that. And so that's the end of chapter 5, and that brings us up to almost the halfway point of Being in Time. The next section will be on care as the being of Dasein.